All right, welcome back to the Hate Crime Advocacy Scheme's Hate Crime Awareness Campaign. And we're here today with Louise Kennedy, our Policy and Communications Manager here at Victim Support Northern Ireland. She's going to explore a little bit of the ramifications and recommendations of what's been explored in Judge Marinen's recent review on expanding legislation on hate crime, as well as just discuss generally about how we can better protect victims and how policy can be formed to create a structure that helps victims in the long run and through the judicial process and providing them emotional support in the wakes of hate crimes incurred. So this is what she had to say, and thank you for being with us. Louise, as Policy and Communications Manager here at Victim Support, I think it's probably fair to say that most people in society would say that hate crime is a subject that needs to be addressed and tackled throughout society. But policy is obviously very important in forming a structure and a strategy in doing so. So I just want to kind of pick your brain and see some of the work that you're doing here in Victim Support and sort of from a policy perspective in regards to hate crime.
Yeah, I suppose, the idea of hate crime, no one is in favor of hate crime, but I think, the policy work is kind of more boiling it down to that detail of, so what constitutes hate crime? How do we tackle it in society? And, one way that that's been done recently is through Judge Marinen's review of hate crime. And what he has done is he has taken the law that we have now and analysed it to see, is it fit for purpose? And when he consulted on it, when he was asking people, one of the things that I had to do was analyse, what we think at Victim Support of that law. And what we have found is that it really, in the current state, isn't really fit for purpose. What you have is what's called an enhanced sentencing regime, and that means that ordinary laws or crimes are charged, and you can go through the whole system and not hear anything about the hate crime element, and then at the end the judge can choose whether or not to make the sentence stronger if there was a hate motivation for it. But in practice what's ended up happening is that you have basically the hate element just drops off somewhere in the middle, so no one is getting to court and actually talking about the hate motivation for these crimes. And that's damaging in so many ways, because the people who experience these crimes, one, a hate crime, there has to be a crime that happens in the first place, and then there has to be a hate motivation behind it. So the people who are going to court, these victims, have experienced a crime, but they've also experienced the knowledge that they were targeted because of who they are, because of something they can't change. And when they get to court and the hate element isn't there and it's charged like any normal crime, now of course it's terrible if a crime happens to anybody, but not to have the recognition that they were targeted because of their identity, because of their ethnicity, because of the colour of their skin, because of the disability they have, because of who they love. For that not to be recognised by our justice system feels like injustice. And I think that was one of the reasons why we were very strong, and we wanted to say very strongly that the current legal regime needs to change. So we endorsed changing it to an aggravated offence model, which is what Judge Marinen has gone with. And, it's great, but obviously it hasn't happened yet because it requires law to change it. So that's going to be the next step.
And are you optimistic that the recommendations will be implemented, or?
I'd like to think they would be. I think, the likes of the Gillen Review has shown that with enough energy behind something and at least having champions driving forward, you can actually make the change. The last thing I'd like to see, or anyone wants to see, is that the work of Judge Marinen sits on a shelf and goes nowhere. Now, that is obviously a risk, because what we have right now is you have a Northern Ireland Assembly and Executive. They've got a really short mandate because of the Assembly collapse. They're basically trying to get a load of legislation through in this last 18 months or year, less than 18 months, year and a bit. Yeah. And that, there's a lot on the legislative programme for all of the departments. And it is very, very possible, and likely, that the hate crime changes aren't going to be in the equation for this mandate.
Sure.
But if it's kicked down the line, then there's always the danger that the next mandate and the next group of politicians and the next, ministers aren't going to give it the attention it deserves. From our perspective, from the campaigns and lobbying perspective, we don't want that to happen. And so we'll be obviously keeping on it. And I know that obviously as our, having the hate crime coordination within victim support, we're not going to let that go. But certainly, it's something that we think needs to happen sooner rather than later.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Louise, so obviously included in the review was very positive feedback on the hate crime advocacy scheme with a list of recommendations. How do you see those recommendations and how it may enhance the scheme moving forward?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that, obviously Judge Marinen's review, if you look at it, has gone beyond just the very, strict confines of the law. He's done that, but he also broadened it out a little bit to talk about the scheme and to talk about, the other things that we need to do in order to tackle hate crime, eradicate it, and all the rest of it. And one of the things that he did focus on was the hate crime advocacy scheme and the need for it. And I think that was great because, we see that it's, the law is fine and the justice is, the process is, that's one thing. But, this is not about process, this is about people. And this is about people who are suffering because they have been victims of crime. And to hone in on those recommendations for the advocacy scheme to be expanded and to be put on a proper footing and to have secure funding, there is a bit of I think, a sigh, an exhalation of relief that has been recognised because, law and legislation are important, but so is being able to bring victims along, make sure that they're getting the care that they need to recover from the harm that they've experienced, and also helping them through a criminal justice process, which is process driven and isn't always a friendly or restorative place for victims of crime. So I think having honed in on that advocacy scheme as one way to mitigate the harm that's been done and to help victims navigate the process, what you're doing is you're recognizing that there are people in the midst of this, people who have suffered harm. You are giving them extra tools and support to be able to go through the process. You're then therefore hopefully increasing their confidence in the criminal justice process. And ultimately at the end of the day, we're getting to a point where justice is done and justice is seen to be done. And that, the likes of, by hate crimes being tried in courts and people going through that, it means that we as a society see that we have zero tolerance to it. And I think that those optics and that message is very, very important for victims, for their communities, and just for society as a whole.
Well, and I think that's vitally important. I mean, the judicial process and the law can be maybe a very cold thing, a very difficult thing for victims and witnesses to go through. So I think maybe having that community side of things and working in successful partnership with other, especially organizations to tackle hate crime is vital. So
for sure,
absolutely. One of the topics that I know that you're passionate about and is a very, very difficult subject to traverse is the subject of freedom of speech versus hate speech. Can you dive into that a little bit and sort of your perspective from a policy point of view?
Well, I suppose one of the big issues and sort of when people were railing against a lot of the proposed changes was that they could impact on freedom of expression, freedom of religion and so forth. And I suppose I feel that there was a bit of a conflation or a bit of a confusion between what was going on there in terms of the hate crime proposals. Hate crime and hate speech are two different things, and they're governed under different laws. Hate crime is where a crime is committed against someone, like an ordinary crime like assault or criminal damage or whatever. And it is sort of upgraded, if you will, to a hate crime if the motivation was hate. Hate speech, on the other hand, is speech that not only conveys hatred, but very, very importantly, it has to have the effect of stirring up hatred in others, which is a very high threshold hard to prove, hard to traverse. And therefore, I think I understand freedom of expression and freedom of religion concerns, but I think it's important to remember that there is no single right that isn't qualified. Different people's rights have to be balanced and qualified to make sure that we're all being protected. And in having that very, very high bar when it comes to hate speech, that's how freedom of expression is protected. So I think that the balance is right there. And in fact, it is very high. Back to hate crime, I think, if we look at it, when we're talking about someone who is committing a crime against someone, I don't think any of the detractors would actually, if asked, say, well, I actually think they should be able to, commit assault against someone, or commit criminal damage, or commit another crime, and if the motivation was hate, that should be protected in any way. I don't think that's the case. I just think that maybe the public discourse on it got a wee bit muddled up.
Sure.
But I do think that on balance, Marinin has has picked his way very carefully through that and has gotten that balance right.
Do you think we could find a more perfect balance? I mean, it'd probably be unrealistic to say that it'll ever be perfectly balanced between those two things, freedom of speech and hate speech. But do you think through his recommendations that it's possible to achieve a better balance?
I think so. And, I think at the end of the day, there's always going to be tension between competing rights.
Yeah.
But, where hate crime and hate speech are concerned, we're talking about actual damage to whole communities.
Sure.
And we're talking about, when we look at hate crime as a whole, there is a very, clear reason why people get an aggravated offence, or, they get stronger sentencing if it's hate motivated. And that is because it's not just the person who is affected by a hate crime, it is everyone else who identifies similarly. So if you have a person who is assaulted because they are LGBT, because they have, they're from a different country, they speak a different language, they have brown or black skin, they are Asian, they have a disability, it's not just them who think I am not safe. They do think that, because, they're wondering, when am I going to be targeted again for something that I have literally no control over? But everyone else who identifies similarly are then thinking, well, are we all targets just because of who we are? And I think that is the very strong reason why there is enhanced sentencing or aggravated offences with regards to hate crime. So, I think it is important that those things are recognised, and I think that Judge Marinin has gotten the balance right.
Brilliant. And another thing, there are recommendations that legislation be expanded to cover other categories, such as hate crime related to gender and hate crime related to age. I imagine we all see those as positive things, but are there parts of the review you didn't feel went far enough, or categories that weren't covered that maybe could have been in more detail?
Well, I suppose just in terms of the extra categories, victim support, we looked through the different proposals. Now, we weren't quite convinced of the age argument, not to say that it is not absolutely abhorrent if someone is targeted because of their age, but we wondered if there was a conflation there between vulnerability and hate. But to be fair, at the end of the day, we think that vulnerability should carry enhanced measures in the law anyway. So, we're willing to sort of say, yep, fair enough. And with regard to the gender issue, we had actually gone further to say that perhaps there should be more specificity with regards to hate on the basis of misogyny, as in against women and against trans folks. I think at the end of the day, having something in there, and I think expanding the hate crime regime to include gender and age can only be good things. I think it's important that we recognise, like when you look at the hate that women experience, particularly online, on the streets, the idea that it's not a hate crime if you look at it objectively. Like if you replaced the hate that women receive and you replaced it with, if that person was being targeted with that language or those actions for disability or because of their race, or it would be a no-brainer. So I think we have such ingrained patriarchy in our societies that perhaps we don't realise just how horrendous it is. But certainly we are very much in favour of that, of those two things being that to be expanded. And I think it can only do a good thing. Like when you see the arguments that are happening now about having a violence against women strategy, when you see the murder of Sarah Everard, when you see the murder of the two women in Newton Abbey, this is a problem that is not going away. And by just addressing it individually, instead of thinking, well, why are these crimes happening against women overwhelmingly? You're not tackling the root cause. And I think the gender-based hate crime will help tackle the root cause, and a violence against women strategy will do the same.
Excellent. Louise, can you talk about a little bit about the significance of working in partnership within the hate crime advocacy scheme with our partner organizations, Leonard Cheshire, the Migrant Center, and the Rainbow Project? what's the importance and significance there, both within the hate crime advocacy scheme and tackling hate crime in partnership across the advocacy sector?
Well, first of all, I think it's fair to say that that kind of partnership just cannot be underestimated, because what you have in the scheme is a group of organisations who are all experts in their relative fields, and who know exactly what those needs are for people who are targeted for hate crime on different grounds. So it's been brilliant. I think for victim support to be working with the likes of Rainbow, with Leonard Cheshire, with the Migrant Centre, to be able to provide the best possible advocacy and support for the different victims of different kinds of hate crime. I suppose, what I'd like to see going forward is a sort of streamlining of the process. We've got the right people in the room, we've got the right experts, but it's about getting the right process that puts the victim at the heart of it, so they're not having to tell their story too many times. So we just keeping building those partnerships, not just between ourselves. I think we continue to do that, but also with police and with the other statutories, to make sure that it is a streamlined process that absolutely is completely victim focused and victim centred. And I think a lot of the Marham recommendations give scope for us to be able to do that. And I think it's, if these come to pass, these are very exciting times for the advocacy scheme.